Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today. Vishaan Chakrabarti and Ruchika lead PAU, a New York City-based architecture and urban planning firm dedicated to building ecological, equitable, and joyous communities. PAU embraces architecture and city planning as allied fields, breaking down disciplinary boundaries by expanding the definition of architecture and rejecting the silos that have ossified it. Their designers use both sides of their brains to be as creative as they are analytical. And this team of 30, along with a network of experienced collaborators and open-minded clients, all come to PAU inspired by their design to palpably and positively impact the world. I also want to say a special thank you to Vishaan, because Vishaan is about to board a plane. So he will be giving the first half of today's presentation, and then he unfortunately has to jump out so he doesn't miss his plane. But we really appreciate him fitting us in today for this presentation. And with that, I'll hand over the mic to you, Vishaan. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Greetings from LaGuardia Airport. Ruchi and I are thrilled to be recipients with our entire firm of this award. It's a great honor. So thank you so much. We want to talk about adaptive reuse and more broadly what we call the architecture of the palimpsest, a word I'm sure many of you know, which refers to the layers of history of our lives and of the city. Because we really think of adaptive reuse not just of buildings, but of the entire city and existing cities and our existing communities, and how we think about their history and narratives. And so we often go back to this Walter Benjamin quote that many of you may have heard as a Laurie Anderson lyric, history is an angel being blown backwards into the future. And what this image conjures is this notion that when we think about progress, we don't think about it as a blank slate like you did in the 20th century, but of layers of history, like a palimpsest, where you pull the past forward with you into the future. And we try to do that with all of our work. It's hard to think about the future given what we're building. The planet is expanding to almost 10 billion people by the end of this century. We're suburbanizing at alarming rates. Most of that is deeply, deeply homogenous. But the fact is, so are our downtowns, where we've corporatized modernism, and universal modernism has become something that is banal and not worthy of our great cities. And so we need to approach this differently in the 21st century. So we start with this idea of urbanity. My book, The Architecture of Urbanity, came out yesterday, and it was really a group effort from the firm. This is one of the pages that tracks the morphology of our collective communities across the world from antiquity. The pandemic has proved this. We are a collective species. We're going to continue to be a collective species. And we want the condition of urbanity. So what is that exactly? It's not size. It's not about big cities necessarily. And it's not about elitism. It's really about diversity and where different people can come together, creating a culture of difference, which can happen in a village, it can happen in a metropolis. And it's different than just this idea of hanging with your tribe. It's really about confronting difference face to face, in real space, in real life, as in contrast to social media. And this way that we can then create difference as something, or celebrate difference as something that moves culture forward. Urbanity requires the serendipity of public space, not just as we designers design it, but as people use it, as communities use it as they see fit. And these are wonderful drawings done by a gentleman named Mark Faulkner in our office to explain that idea. We know urbanity, true urbanity, is conducive to public health. We know actually that the strength of people's social bonds actually lead to more longevity and more public health. We know that it advances progress. This is a Charles Correa diagram of Doxiades' theory about different people creating progress in density. And so this is what we try to promote in our office, what we try to build. This is our office in Union Square in the heart of New York City. We came out of the gate about 9 years ago with this mission statement that we are dedicated to building ecological, equitable, and joyous communities. and talking about not only what we do and what we don't do. So this is really what we do. These are the practice areas that we do, but it's also the process of co-design, working with communities. And we have a motto in our office, which is that place needs connection. It actually responds to a method, this idea that we read place in terms of climate and context, that we establish needs with not just our client, but the community. And through place and needs, we build connection at the scale of the individual through construction, at the scale of the community through the city, and at the scale of the planet through the climate. We started with a lot of advocacy work. We continue to do that advocacy work with partners like the New York Times. You might have seen our housing article last December about how we can go on road diets and use our streets for public space. And this has all led to a diversity of experience from urban planning to large scale architecture projects, institutional work. And we're just going to talk about a couple of those projects now. Our first built work, InterOculus, this is for the Miller Prize in the wonderful place known as Columbus, Indiana, which of course is a mecca for architects. I probably don't have to explain what it is to this crowd. You're looking through the Pay Library at Henry Moore to a church by the First Saarinen. And we won something called the Miller Prize, where you're asked to do a pavilion structure, something actually usually temporary. We did a great deal of community engagement with students in the town, Zoom calls, ice cream parlors, and we were given this assignment of revitalizing downtown. And this is an adaptive reuse project, but of an intersection where we knew in this intersection that a lot of cultural activities happened. And we looked at everything from the Pantheon to the wigwams of the indigenous people that are from that area, as well as kind of the honky tonk architecture of local state fairs. And we presented the community with this drawing after hearing that they wanted this gathering space. Because the thing that's amazing about Columbus is it has all of this world famous architecture, but it has very little public gathering space other than some beautiful parks that are directly outside of the downtown. And so this we thought we could solve by creating this canopy and creating an invitation for the community to close the streets and use this space for lots of events. And this became so popular that they not only approved it, but we actually had to raise more money to make it not permanent, but something that would last over time. And so we were the general contractors as well as the architects. We built this thing in a matter of weeks, and you see it going up. And there it sits today in the heart of Columbus, Indiana, and it sits there for parties. It sits there for snow load, and it will be there for some time, we think. And it's sustainable because it will be there for some time, and it's not temporary. And it is a place for gathering. It is a place for the culture of gathering. And we've seen in this little town enormous diversity from African American communities to Japanese American communities to South Asian people who come and celebrate this place. Pride Week in Mike Pence's Indiana, really extraordinary expressions of joy that happen under this simple canopy structure. And this reminds us of one of my favorite Aldo Van Eyck quotes: whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more, because it is about how people give meaning to architecture through use. And so that brings us to kind of the main project we're going to talk about today, Domino. Ruchi worked by my side, as she did with InterOculus, on this. So we're going to talk about this in two phases. I've been working on this site for over 10 years. First, when I was a partner at Shop Architects, when we were doing the master plan, which was authored under Shop, and then with field operations and Lisa Switkin, a brilliant landscape architect. This is an 11-acre site that was separated from the community. And actually, there's 4 communities around here, an Orthodox Jewish community, an African American, a Latinx community, as well as a kind of hipster community. They didn't engage with each other much until this park was built. And now you see all of their kids playing together in the playground, which gives me hope for the future when I look at places like the Middle East and think that people of difference, if they actually spend time eye to eye, they might resolve their differences peacefully. And so this is what the site used to look like. The sugar refinery itself is a historic landmark, was a historic landmark. The sugar refinery moved to Baltimore and to Yonkers. And so this site was sold to various developers who took it through a couple of different master plans, first the Vignoli master plan, and then the shop master plan, which is what you see on the screen. And it was really about extending the street grid, building a lot of public space, and really celebrating the refinery. And so years later, after we formed POW, POW was given the commission to put a creative office building with lots of public space at the base of the building, um, and create a new piece of architecture out of this. The only thing is the building wasn't a building. We did this drawing to explain to the Landmarks Commission and the public what the building was, which was an envelope for machinery. And so the fenestration, the facade was actually largely fake. Those windows didn't correlate to floor plates. They correlated to a lot of machinery inside. The building was actually completed as three buildings. There had been a fire on this site. The building burned down. The Havermeyer family rebuilt it as these three buildings. Because there were three buildings and because the windows didn't correspond to floor plates, the windows didn't line up at all across the building. And so when the client first called, he said, we have to put this building in, but none of the floor plates will resolve across the different sill heights. It's really hard to get light in the building with small windows. And I kind of drew this sketch as he was talking to think about building a building inside of the building, a kind of what Justin Davidson called a bottle inside of a ship. So the idea was to get light and air into the building. Actually had a friend from Berkeley, Chris Human, do this extraordinary photon analysis that helped us establish the width of the gap between the new building and the old building that would let ambient light in to the lowest floor. Because this was the historic condition. And so again, there was this gap with steel tiebacks that held back this machinery. And you can see what I mean by the fenestration not really corresponding to floor plates. By the way, if you learn about sugar refinery, about sugar refinement, you will never eat refined sugar again. It's disgusting. But basically, we went to Landmarks with this photograph and with this idea of wanting to build a building inside of a building and said, we can emulate that historic condition in a new condition with new steel tiebacks, new ring beams, which Ruchi will talk about, with a modern curtain wall held back from the original brick facade. It would snow and rain in this space, and this would bring light into the core of the building, into the center of the building. And that is that image going from rendering to photograph. Lisa Switkin from Field Operations, our landscape architect, had this idea of planting these pin oaks. There's all this biophilia. There's biophilia on the ring beams. And so it's absolutely magical inside. The light is extraordinarily magical inside. And so we're very proud that we were able to execute this very complex idea, but actually something that's quite elegant of this new building placed in this old one. This is an image from inside the building. So the brick actually acts as a thermal barrier, a solar shade. The light in the building is never too bright. There's never too much glare. I'm going to make a daring comparison and say, I love the light in the Kimball, Lucan's masterpiece. I'm not going to compare it to the Kimball, but there is an ambience to the light in the building that comes from these layers that I think is really quite extraordinary. So I'd encourage you to visit inside of the building if you can. The next issue this raised of this building inside of a building is this pushed some of the development rights above the height of the brick. And so the question became, what should the form of that be? And we tested about 45 different forms, and we kept coming back to a couple of precedents. This is, of course, Barron's turbine factory and that vault, but also the fact that the original building, and you can see the brick windows there, were built in the American round arch style. I mentioned that the earlier building had burned down. What happened with factory buildings is the wood lintel that held the brick above the window often caught fire in factories in the late 1800s. And so the American round arch style was developed to eliminate the wood lintel and create a brick support system as a fire retardance device, which we thought was an incredible piece of innovation that we wanted to pay homage to. in terms of this simple, elegant barrel vault. The barrel vault also did a number of things. It did what arches do. We eliminated all the internal columns, and we were able to then land the foundations further from the original brick foundations, which, as you can imagine, are not plumb. It's an old factory building. And so there were a number of efficiencies gained by using this vault. And so there it sits in the skyline. Amidst, directly to the right is a building by Shop, 325 Kent, and then Annabelle Seldorf's building is going up. To the left is Rick Cook's building, and then in the gap between will be Joshua Ramos's building. So this whole kind of smorgasbord of great architects, but really we think of our building as kind of the jewel in the crown, not because we think our architecture is better than others, but because it is this resonance with the past. I was very involved with the High Line in the Bloomberg administration, and to me, the two have a certain similarity. This idea, as I said, with that Walter Benjamin quote, that we pull history forward with us. And so even though the city evolves and changes, we keep our narratives and our history. And so this building can't be in Shanghai or Dubai or Mumbai. It can only be here on the industrial Brooklyn waterfront. And that's why I think it's become quite beloved. Um, the other thing about this, we've talked about, the sky plane and the way the barrel vault came about, but it's also important. We're always very focused as an urbanist firm on the way buildings meet the ground. We had worked very hard on the master plan at Shop and at field operations. And so we wanted to make sure that as Pau did the architecture for this building, that we really made the building as porous and as open as possible, opened up the windows to door height. I want to say the Landmarks Commission and the Landmarks community were extraordinary. They went with us on this journey of this barrel vault, of taking out a lot of the old cracked windows. So we don't think of those processes as bureaucracy. We're building in people's neighborhoods, we're building in people's communities, and we think we owe it to them to have a conversation and a process with them about what goes there. And we think the project is better for it. And so that's what the project looks like today. You can see how that plaza in front of the building that Lisa is designing with those big open brick portals are now ready for the bars and restaurants and cafes that are going to spill out onto them and make this a truly urban experience. That is only one part of this narrative. Ruchi's now going to tell you a more in-depth story. Ruchi is one of the most talented architects with whom, I think the most talented architect with whom I've ever worked, and understands this project from cradle to grave. And so she's going to take it from here, and I'm going to go catch my flight. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Architizer. Take care, Paul.
Thanks so much, Vishaan. Appreciate it. Just going to have to unmute you. There we go.
There we
Welcome.
go. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to pick up where Vishaan left off. And, he talked about reading before writing. So needless to say, the design process for the architecture of the Palimpsest must begin by reading the layers of history before we layer in the contemporary. And so we began by reading the historic structure that you see here, specifically the masonry facade. A comprehensive masonry survey was conducted to make sure that what we were proposing was appropriate and would in no way compromise its integrity. We were, after all, exposing the interior face of the masonry to the elements, and also to evaluate the level of rehabilitation, the intervention that would be needed, which we wanted to keep to a minimum to preserve the patina. So the test revealed that what we were dealing with was relatively hard brick of good construction quality, and that the brick on the inside face of the wall was also of exterior quality, which was, a serious bit of good luck there. However, the good quality of the masonry notwithstanding, we, and by that I mean our excellent structural team at Silman, led by Pat Arnett, still had to come up with a plan to temporarily brace it during demolition and construction, which was a project unto itself. and actually with its own set of construction documents. So this is what that temporary bracing looked like. It was a combination of bracing the towers up against the facade and horizontal trusses on the interior where we didn't have room on the street side for the towers, all tied to continuous interior belts holding the masonry facade up while the historic structure was carefully dismantled, literally piece by piece. And this is what it looked like, you know, deceptively simple from the exterior. Because on the interior, it was anything but. There was this intricate choreography of melding the temporary and permanent bracing systems. The latter obviously had to follow the former, while the former had to be situated so that it didn't interfere with the latter. So you see what I mean here. It kind of looked like a jungle gym on steroids for a while there. Which brings me to the permanent masonry bracing system. So these are some early options we studied, like a whole range. And actually we started off trying to see if it was possible to avoid breaching the curtain wall. Could we have a structural element on the exterior of the curtain wall to tie back the masonry to? But eventually we settled on one that did need to negotiate the curtain wall. So we have outriggers from the columns going through the curtain wall to ring beams all around that stabilize the masonry. Which brings me to the curtain wall, the contemporary element in the architecture of the palimpsest. So we had 6 different wall types. I'm not going to bore you with every single one, but I'm going to show you 3 of the more interesting ones. So obviously the penetration of the outriggers through the curtain wall, clearly the most challenging detail in the entire project. So here you see 2 plan details. The one on the left is the standard detail through the mullion, and the one on the right is the one with the outrigger penetrating through it. It's really important to note that this detail would not have been possible with a standard male-female system of interlocking extrusions, but it was possible with Foki's. Foki was our curtain wall manufacturer, with their custom fully gasketed female-female system. So to make the system, to make sure that the system was air and water tight with the outrigger penetration, Foki developed this custom gasket that you see on the left, which wraps around the outrigger, making a flexible connection to allow for movement and yet, maintaining that air and water tightness. So some installation photos. Here on the left, you see that custom gasket around the outrigger and how the outrigger kind of slots into the vertical mullion profile. And now moving on to another curtain wall type. This is the end caps of the barrel vault. So we wanted this expanse of wall to be as light and free of structural elements as possible, which was kind of the main engineering challenge here. The lower panels are double height, they're up to 22 feet with curved extrusions at the perimeter. And you can see here why transparency was of paramount importance. And then, moving on to the crowning glory of the new enclosure, quite literally, the curved glazed barrel vault, which spans almost 60 feet over 3 floors. So we started off studying all different kinds of systems. We studied a stick-built system, which was prohibitive both in terms of labor cost and time. We studied a fully unitized system, which was a no-go because of the complexity introduced by the curvature of the facade and the fact that it's pretty much actually not a facade, but a skylight. It transitions from one to the other. So we went with a pre-assembled unitized mega panel, approximately 20 feet by 15, spanning between the curved structural steel. Each panel has a curved structural steel frame with aluminum carrier frames, curved IGUs. These are true hot bent curved IGUs with low E coating inner laminated lights, and a dual frit for solar control on the top 5. A mock-up was tested off-site, obviously. And then, by the way, all of this took place during the pandemic. So this was literally the height of the pandemic. So with all the attendant uncertainty and disruption, Foki decided to move the assembly of the mega panels from Italy, where they're based, to a facility in Connecticut. And that's where the mega panels were assembled. So you see here. They were then loaded and trucked and craned into position, which was a bit harrowing to watch, actually. And then wet sealed. So there was rope access provided to apply the 2-line wet seal. And that's the last of the mega panels being set into position. The entire curtain wall installation took 6 months. And that was reduced from a 9-month schedule by overlapping the installation of the lower floors with a spider crane and the upper floors with a tower crane. And that's the final product. It's not finished yet, so there's no finished floor. You're just seeing the floors, the structural slab, but the curtain wall portion of it is finished. And here you see it in action. That was actually the opening party almost exactly a year ago. So, it's a place of gathering. And, Vishaan talks about serendipitous encounters. And certainly this is a place for that, because it's meant for both the office tenants, but also the larger public, based on what kind of an event is occurring here. It's a place of joy and celebration. So I'm gonna conclude by saying it's really a testament to our belief that the architecture of urbanity, that what we refer to as connective design, can truly help engender joy and this culture of pluralism and harmony. We literally witness it here in action every single day. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this vision, which we at POW, we believe it's not only achievable, but also imperative, is to, dream of a world where nature and humanity can coexist in perfect harmony. And I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. Went faster than I thought it would. I think Vishaan rushed.
No problem at all. It was, you just told the story so beautifully and so clearly, and I think you led us on a visual journey there that I just found absolutely fascinating. I think this was already one of my favorite projects in New York before this presentation, and now it's even more so. Huge fan of adaptive reuse as a kind of genre, and this is really an extraordinary example. So thank you so much for sharing. There are a few questions coming in, but I'm a total nerd for this stuff, so I have a couple for myself as well before we go to the audience questions. I guess one question I had for you was about collaboration with other consultants and experts. Obviously, the engineering that went into this project was pretty essential. And yeah, I'm just curious, so how early in a project like this do you begin to collaborate with an engineer? I'm assuming quite early, but yeah, I'm just curious, sort of what the nature of that what is the nature of that conversation? How much do they kind of have an input into the actual design, I guess, because it's such a the design and structure is so kind of integrated together in a project like this. So yeah, just curious to sort of hear about that relationship that you have with those experts.
It literally began day one. There was, as we were learning more about the building, and we learned the fact that it wasn't a single building, it was 3 different buildings, that the facade grid didn't line up from one facade to the other. And we came up with this idea of let the idiosyncratic structure be what it is, and let's just drop a brand new building inside of it. That was an idea that was born out of the exigencies of the existing conditions, but we had to then immediately test it to see if what we were proposing was actually true. So as Vishaan mentioned, one of the first things that we did was we hired a consultant who also happened to be Vishaan's classmate from back when he was in grad school, to conduct a photon analysis. And that photon analysis was basically meant to either prove our hypothesis or disprove it one way or the other, but it ended up saying, yes, what we were proposing would in fact do what we thought it would do, which is bring more light and air into the building. So that was early on, before we even really put pen to paper. It was an idea that we tested very quickly. And then from there, our next sort of drinking buddies, because all we did was talk about this project, and we couldn't really have any conversations without them at the table, were our structural engineers. And there, I sort of breezed through it, this whole negotiating the historic facade portion, but that was a huge challenge. It was a huge challenge to first design a way to permanently brace it in a way that didn't take away from the historic patina, didn't damage it, or managed to sort of preserve it. Yes, so that's the temporary bracing that you see there. But that was actually step 2. So we had to first design the permanent bracing system and how that would work with the new intervention and sort of stitch the old and the new together, quite literally. Then we had to come up with this temporary bracing system, which was there just to hold the masonry up while the historic structure was removed and the new was installed. And that the entire process was so complicated and technical, and we couldn't have done it without them. And I have to say, Pat from Silman and his team were absolutely extraordinary. I don't know anyone else who could have done it the way that they did. And then there was the new intervention, which is the curtain wall, the new building enclosure, which had to, mediate this sort of stitching of the old with the new. And that was a complete invention, like the detail there was a total invention. And that wasn't our invention. We were like, figure out a way to do this. And it was our engineers who figured that out. It was, Silman, our structural engineer, and Foki, our curtain wall manufacturers. They're the ones who sort of, put their heads together and came up with that ingenious gasket detail that worked and, worked really, really well, and exactly with the design intent that we had in mind. So yes, this was a team effort, and we could not have, gone beyond an idea. We couldn't have gone from day 1 to day 2 without them by our side.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was such a great in-depth response. I think there's a lot of kind of cliches out there about architects and engineers kind of being against each other or being at war in some way. And this is such a great antidote to that.
I would say every single project in our office is an antidote to that. That's just not how we function. We don't work that way. I love my engineer partners, and they are very much part of the design process. And we don't just like come up with something and then throw it their way and say, now make it work. Like that's not, we want to know what the structure wants to do. We want to know what the engineering constraints are and then use them as fodder in design. And that's really the only way that you can come up with something that I think is worth anything. Yeah, we don't function that way at all.
Yeah, I think Vishaan said earlier also about not viewing governmental institutions or councils as just bureaucracy to kind of wade through, but also a collaborator, which I also think is a really great lesson, because I know that a lot of architects find them frustrating to work with. But if you kind of view them as partners, clearly the outcome is more positive, as this project is a great example of. So yeah, this is really it's really refreshing to hear about these kind of positive partnerships. We have some really great questions coming in. Joseph was asking about the time saving on the curtain wall installation, which I think was a really interesting kind of detail. You talked about overlapping phases of construction to save time. Yeah, I just wondered if you could go into any more detail on maybe the rationale for that, like what, who was driving this deadline, and the reasons why, perhaps, and kind of how you came to that solution.
Well, the deadline was definitely driven by our client, Two Trees, who, by the way, I should also mention, were an incredible collaborator in this entire thing. And I don't know anyone other than Two Trees who would have built a project like this. It was really about doing what's right for the project. And it wasn't just, counting your dollars and looking at the bottom line. So they basically charged Foki to see if they could cut down on the construction timeline, and which is typical. I don't know any client who wouldn't want to do that. Time equals money. There's general conditions. There's all kinds of overheads and costs that you can save on if you can save on construction schedule. So this was something that Two Trees asked Foki to look at, and they came back with this idea that, so we had the mega panels on the barrel vault, a totally different type of installation, and we had the unitized panels below the barrel vault. One was going to be installed using this, crane, and the other one was going to be installed using those scissor lifts from the gap in the perimeter. So they basically came up with this idea that they could do the two simultaneously, and then the floor where they come together, or the sort of threshold floor between the barrel vault and the straight wall, is a unique condition, which I actually didn't end up presenting. That's also a bent panel, but it's not a mega panel, and it's not a hot bent IGU. It's actually a cold bent IGU, which you can't really tell. So that's a sort of unique condition, which kind of bridge the two different systems. So we had to come up with a slightly different detail for the spandrel over there, because that was sort of the last bit to go in. So there was a slight kind of tweaking of design, but what that allowed us to do is literally like I mentioned, overlap installation, start both from the bottom up and the top down. And because of that, we ended up saving 3 months, which is actually quite a lot in construction years. Yeah,
absolutely. I also just want to commend you for including construction photos in the presentation, fabrication as well, fabrication and construction in the presentation, because the visual story that tells is incredible. I think there are firms that don't like to show this stuff. They want to show the finished, polished, perfect end result. Sometimes we see a sketch and then the finished result, but seeing these steps in between, it really kind of makes everything a lot more understandable, and also goes to like show those, you know, all the different players that go into making this possible, like we were talking about, the collaborators. And you know, it's also just epic to see the New York skyline with these people working in front of it. Really love this photograph.
Yeah, no, and it's so much part of the story, and it's so interesting. I mean, really watching this, you know, as Vishaan said, you know, Justin Davidson did say it was like building a ship in a bottle, and it couldn't be more true. Like the construction process and, you know, visuals from this project are definitely worth presenting because they're just so interesting. And, you know, the Manhattan skyline notwithstanding, just watching these people crane these giant, you know, mega panels, you know, teetering on that like ledge was just so harrowing. Like even now when I think about it, like my stomach turns. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so scary. But that's how buildings get built in places like New York, where, you know, you just don't have the real estate to stage things and be more comfortable. Things are quite precarious.
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar from those construction photos you see of the Empire State Building, which are also
Exactly.
hair-raising. A little bit more, you know, technology. The cranes are a little bit better now, but
yeah, and these guys are wearing harnesses. I don't think the ones on the Empire, I don't think there were any harnesses. They were just like tightrope walking.
very true. Yeah. Still, nonetheless, very, very impressive. So yeah, Carissa had a nice question about the interior. She asked, could you elaborate if any efforts were made to cultivate a narrative on the interior experience? Were there any steps done on the micro scale to contribute to the story of old and new? So, you know, I think the texture, and that you mentioned the patina being visible on the walls. But yeah, would love to hear a little bit more about how you thought about expressing the old and the new, and the kind of relationship between the two.
Yeah, so you know, this is an office building, and all of the floors are basically going to be, you know, tenanted by, you know, office tenants who will then do their own interiors, right? Like, so we're not actually, and typically in office buildings, the architect, you know, who designed the building doesn't go in and also do the interior design for the office spaces. So there, it's really just about this view out of the curtain wall, and, you know, you kind of see that layering of space and, you know, layering of time as you look through the glass to the sort of, you know, verdant garden in the gap and the patina of the brick, and then through the windows, and you see the river, or you see Brooklyn, and you see the city beyond. You know, it really kind of compresses that entire space in a very interesting way. But in the lobby, for instance, like the office lobby that you access off of Kent, there, as soon as you enter, the sort of big wall that you face above the front desk is this textured brick wall. And that brick is all brick that's been reclaimed from the original building. So, you know, there were all these party walls inside, you know, that divided the three buildings. So that was all demolished, and a lot of that brick was salvaged, and that's been reused in the lobby. And it's really this absolutely stunning, you know, there's like this brick pattern work in that wall. And then, so there's the texture from the coursing and the pattern, but then there's the texture from the patina. And it's, it's absolutely stunning. So that's one place where you again bring this old and new together. And then another aspect, so the Domino Sugar sign that you see on the building right now, the one that, the big yellow sign, that's actually not the original sign. That's an exact reproduction of the original sign, but made with LEDs. The original sign was neon or like some other form of lighting, which is not sustainable, extremely energy intensive. And of course, we were trying to, make this building as sustainable as possible. And it was also in, pretty poor conditions. So we would have had to kind of rehabilitate, like fix it up in a way that was then taking away from the fact that it was original. So instead of reusing that, we reproduced it in a much more, with more sustainable technology. And we gave the original sign to a Brooklyn-based artist who has turned it into an art installation, which is, again, something you can see in the main office lobby. So it's, this giant, you don't recognize it as the original sign, but if you look closely, you're like, wait a minute, that's the same yellow, and I see the rivets. So wait a minute, was that the original sign? It takes a minute for that to compute, but it was repurposed in a very interesting and contemporary manner.
That's fantastic. I'm going to go in person and check that out. Love that detail. That was just making me think about the kind of the heritage of this kind of building in New York. And I, coming from England, I'm more familiar with our kind of system of listed buildings, grade 1, grade 2, and so on. And each one has a different level of, how much it has to be preserved in its, existing form, and, how much you can transform it. I am not as familiar with that in New York. Were there elements of this that you had to keep? What did you have to keep and what did you choose to keep, I guess, is the question. The signage being a good example. I'd be curious to know a little bit more about that.
So it all depends on how you approach the project. I'm not a historic preservationist, so I don't really have, all the details here, but just as a lay architect, what I would say is that, if you were going to go for historic tax credits, that's a whole other process. And it's a much more stringent and regulated and prescriptive process. If we had gone for historic tax credits, we would not have been able to build this building. This was way too disruptive of the original building. So we chose not to go, and by we, I mean Two Trees chose not to go that route. So instead, we did go through landmarks, and that's something you can't avoid. You have to go through landmarks for a building that's been classified as a historic building. But there, it's a much more subjective process. So you have the board, the landmarks committee, and you have to present to them the design, and they will evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. So they, as Vishaan mentioned, from the very beginning, were very, very intrigued. At first, let me just say, this is not a typical adaptive reuse project. Maybe it's becoming more typical as, we move along, but especially, back in 2018 when we presented it, it was not typical. New interventions in historic buildings should not be this bold. They're usually a lot more subdued and a lot more hidden. And you usually try to preserve as much of the historic material as you possibly can. And here we were, proposing this very big, bold barrel vault jutting up from, up beyond the historic building. We were pretty much removing all of the innards, But as we explained, those innards were basically machinery and not conducive to the current program that the building was going to be, built for. And we also ended up, we also proposed removing all of the existing windows. But there, we were able to prove that those existing windows were of like dubious historic value, because most of them weren't original. They had been like swapped up and changed over time. So the vintage was pretty much unknown and, varied. Most of them were absolutely in terrible condition. So they were like falling apart. They would not have met any modern day, criteria. So we would have had to remove all of them and reproduce all of them, which again, defeats the purpose. So it was a conversation with landmarks, and with every, design sort of move that we proposed, we provided a justification that they seemed to agree with. And so by the end of it, they were like, yeah, go for it. And we had a unanimous -1 vote in favor. Only one person voted this design down for the very reasons that I just mentioned, that it was too bold and too big and too disruptive. And they wanted a much more, orthodox approach to adaptive reuse. Besides that one person, everyone else was fully on board. So, that's a long way of saying, if we had gone for the historic tax credits and, followed what was the more prescribed and restrictive definition of adaptive use, we would not have been able to build this.
Such a great and complete answer to my question. Thank you so much. Yeah, this, I find this to be very respectful, actually. It's I would say a perfect balance between the conventional adaptive reuse, but I like to think of this as radical reuse, but it has to be done the right way. And I think this is a great example. Still celebrating this beautiful texture, the brick and the chimney and everything. I think it's good to hear that there was just one dissenter. Fantastic. We're almost at time, but there was one more question, which may be a nice one to finish on, from Abigail, who asks, what would you say is a non-negotiable in creating public urban spaces that successfully unite multiple communities and see plentiful use? So I guess, there's probably many ways to answer that question, but if you had one sort of key element that you think unites all of these kinds of projects, what might that be?
Let me enter this in a easier way, and then I'll see if I can make my way to something that's more universal. But I can start with what that one move was here, for sure. And I think that one move, Vishaan sort of talked about it very, very quickly and then moved on. And I don't think my cursor works on this screen, does it? No, I don't think it does, because I wanted to point to something. But there is a street that separates that waterfront park from the buildings behind the waterfront park. And that street ties into the urban street grid. And this was a very specific move that was made when Vishaan and his team at SHOP redesigned the master plan. And I think that move was the key move that makes this park feel like it's right behind this little amphitheater step. You don't see it, but it's literally like a road that separates the park from Domino or any of the buildings along that line. And that park basically signals to the people that this park is a public park and it doesn't belong to the private development that's sitting right behind it. And that was actually like the key design move, or the key urban planning, urban design move that makes this park the success that it is. I know, like, I might be putting too much weight on it, but I really don't think so, because, you know, there are instances in, say, for example, Battery Park, where there is no separation between those, you know, between the development and the waterfront park and then the water. And the waterfront park basically feels like the front lawn for the people that live in those buildings. It doesn't feel inviting, and it doesn't feel like it belongs to the city. And this sort of separation and then also tying back into the city grid. So by the way, this, no one knows that this road is not a public road, that it's actually a private road that's maintained by Two Trees. Most people that go there don't know that this is actually a private park that's completely operated by Two Trees. People think of it as a public park, and that's all because of the way in which it was designed. So, you know, I think, to extrapolate from this example, I think the key takeaway for me is to use design principles that are, to use a catch-all phrase, like urban in their reading, in their, you know, the gestalt.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I love that. You know, the idea that people have no idea that this is not a public park, but, you know, wants to be used like one, and it clearly is. So, fantastic takeaway. And yeah, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. We've got another 3 Future Fest talks coming up tomorrow, but for now, I just want to thank Ruchika and Vishaan so much for this amazing presentation. I'm thankful that it's going to be a recording of it, so we can look back and reference this in the future as well. Really informative, but also really inspiring as well. Before you go, everybody, make sure that you respond to our poll. Maybe you can follow in the footsteps of Pau, be here next year if your firm wins an A+ award in the coming season. So make sure you respond to the poll and sign up. And until tomorrow, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ruchika. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.